The crack came first, sharp and hollow, followed by an explosion of pain so brutal it stole the air straight out of my chest. The baseball bat had slammed into my ribs with a force that felt like it split me clean in two, the shock of it biting deep into bone. My body collapsed sideways before I even understood what was happening, and then the floor rose up to meet me with a thud that rattled through my skull. I gasped for breath, but nothing came, just a shallow, rasping wheeze that scraped my throat raw. The fire spreading through my side was blinding, every nerve screaming at once. Above me, my brother, Daniel, still had both hands clenched tight around the bat, his knuckles white, his breath coming in heavy bursts, eyes glittering with something cruel. "That's what you get for running your mouth," he spat, voice dripping with contempt. The sound of the bat rolling back onto the hardwood echoed through the room, an almost lazy clatter that made the violence feel even more deliberate. I tasted blood, sharp and metallic, filling my mouth like a warning bell. From the kitchen, my mother's voice floated in, casual and distracted, asking what the noise was. Daniel answered nothing, just said it was no big deal. A second later, my father appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes sliding over me, crumpled on the floor like I was nothing more than a discarded jacket. "Get up," he said flatly. No urgency, no concern. The pain was so deep it drowned everything else out. Each breath stabbed at me from the inside, and every tiny movement threatened to snap something further. My vision tunneled until the edges went black, leaving only the image of Daniel lowering the bat back down, as though he'd just finished practice swings in the backyard. That moment fractured months later when I was walking into the courthouse. The echo of my shoes on the tile was steady, deliberate, every step fueled by the memory of that night. In my hands was a manila envelope, warm from my grip. Inside it were the x-rays that showed the clean, undeniable lines of 2 broken ribs, circled in black ink by the radiologist. I remembered the sound of the bat, the look in Daniel's eyes, the way my father had turned away. The courthouse air was cool, but my skin burned with humiliation and rage. This time the truth wouldn't be buried under excuses or family loyalty. This time the images would speak for me under the bright lights of a courtroom. That night with the bat hadn't just fractured bone. It had shattered the last thread tying me to silence. I grew up in a 2-story house at the edge of a small Ohio town, the kind of place where people waved when you drove by and where the lawns were always clipped just right, hiding what went on inside. My parents, Frank and Janet, prided themselves on appearances, making sure the curtains matched the seasons and the paint on the porch never peeled. But inside, order was something different, an order that revolved entirely around Daniel. From the earliest moments I can remember, he was the center of everything, and I was the shadow. He was the sun in our small family solar system, and I was just another cold planet stuck in orbit. Frank worked long hours at the auto shop, grease always under his nails, but somehow he always had time for Daniel. A clap on the shoulder, a grin when he walked in the door. For me, a nod if I was lucky, as if even acknowledging me was work. Janet could flip warmth on and off like a switch, but with Daniel it was always on. She hovered over him, praised him for every small thing. If he scribbled half a doodle, it went straight to the fridge. When I brought home a perfect test, she barely glanced at it, muttered, "Good job," then turned back to see what Daniel wanted for dinner. That difference wasn't loud, but it was constant, and it sank into me like water through stone. I only realized much later how deeply it had carved me. At school, I pushed myself hard, not because I thought anyone would notice, but because it was the only thing I could control. I was the kid who never turned homework in late, who stayed out of trouble, who tried to be invisible at home because invisibility seemed safer than competing with Daniel. Competing was pointless anyway. Daniel thrived on attention. He could be charming when he wanted something, ruthless when he didn't get it. Our house bent around his moods. If he was in a good one, the whole place felt lighter. If he was in a bad one, the tension rolled in thick like storm clouds. My parents called it normal family dynamics, just a strong-willed son who needed a little more understanding. To me, it was living under weather I couldn't escape. Even when I was a kid, I kept hoping maybe if I worked hard enough, they'd finally see me. When I was 7, I built a whole diorama for the school fair, spent weeks painting little cardboard pieces, cutting them just right. I won first prize and walked home proud, ribbon hanging from my hand. "Yeah." Net barely looked at it, said, "That's nice," then rushed outside to watch Daniel wobble down the driveway on a bike without training wheels. I told myself that was a bigger deal, that maybe my time would come later, but later never came. Instead, the stings stacked up until they became a dull ache. Dinners where Daniel took the stage and my parents laughed at every word. Weekends when my plans got canceled because Daniel had a minor cold. Quiet lessons that his needs came first and mine were optional. That was the backdrop to everything that followed. It's why, when Daniel swung that bat into my ribs, it didn't feel random. It felt like the natural end of years of imbalance. Years where he was taught his wants mattered more than my safety. By the time I hit my teens, the pattern was as fixed as the creak in the stairs or the smell of coffee in the mornings. He was 2 years older and wore it like a crown, justifying every insult, every shove. If I refused to hand over a sweater, he'd storm to our parents, and I'd be scolded for being selfish. If he misplaced something, I was the first suspect. The imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was physical. When I was 12, he slammed my door so hard the mirror shattered. When I was 14, he shoved me against the counter during an argument, leaving a bruise that took weeks to fade. Once, he twisted my arm so hard my wrist sprained. My parents brushed it off as normal sibling rivalry. "Toughen up," Frank said, tossing me an ice pack. To them it was nothing. To me, it was a lesson. My pain wasn't worth their concern. So I started avoiding home. I spent long nights at the library, lingered with my friend Laura, dodging questions about the marks I tried to hide. Meanwhile, Daniel was golden. Queen bee in high school, but in male form, loud, charismatic, surrounded by people who laughed at his jokes. My parents cheered him on at every sports event, every practice, even the small ones. My debate tournaments, my science fairs. If I got a text of good luck, it was a miracle. Even at graduation, when I walked across the stage with honors, they clapped politely. But when Daniel got called for a minor role in a school play, they leapt to their feet like he was Broadway-bound. That was the rhythm. His highs celebrated, my highs ignored. When I left for college, I thought distance might loosen the pattern. Instead, it only changed its shape. When I got an out-of-state internship, Daniel called complaining I'd stolen the opportunity from him. Never mind, he'd never applied. Later that night, Frank and Janet called, asking me to send him money since he was between jobs. When I said no, the cold in their voices lasted months. Even after I moved into my own small apartment, Daniel's reach didn't fade. He showed up uninvited after a breakup, slept on my couch for a week, tore through my kitchen, left dishes piled high, borrowed my coat, returned it with a tear in the sleeve. When I told him to leave, he stormed out and spun the story to my parents. I'd kicked him into the cold heartlessly. Frank's voice on the phone was cutting, accusing me of cruelty. That was when I understood it fully. In their eyes, Daniel was always the one worth protecting, not me. Looking back, that night with the bat wasn't sudden. It was the final act in a long play where my role was always the punching bag. The slammed doors, the bruises, the silence from my parents, all bricks in the wall that boxed me in. The blow from the bat wasn't a random crack of violence. It was the climax of years of being taught my safety was negotiable. And my parents' reaction that night, flat, dismissive, refusing even to call for help, wasn't new. It was just the same old script, played louder. But I didn't know then that something inside me had finally shifted. That this time, the story wouldn't stay buried. That this time, the proof was sitting in an envelope I would carry into court. The spark that lit the fuse came months before the bat ever cracked against my ribs. I had finally saved enough for a down payment on a small 2-bedroom condo at the edge of town. It wasn't anything flashy, but it was mine, the first thing in my life that felt truly earned. Years of extra shifts, skipped vacations, careful budgeting, all poured into a place with keys that belonged only to me. When I told my parents, their congratulations were half-hearted at best, the kind of lukewarm response that left me colder than silence. But when Daniel found out, his reaction was instant and full of entitlement. He called me the next day, saying he needed a place to crash since his lease was up, and he didn't feel like tying himself down to another rental. His tone didn't leave space for me to say no. It was like he had already decided it was done. I told him gently that I had plans for the second bedroom as a workspace and guest room, but he was welcome to visit any time. The line went quiet, then his voice turned sharp. He hung up without another double. 2 days later, Frank called me, saying Daniel was stressed and that letting him stay would be the decent thing to do. I repeated my answer. The disappointment in his voice was heavy, but it didn't sway me. Over the next weeks, the pressure built in quiet digs and sideways comments. Daniel posted vague things online about selfish people who didn't know the meaning of family. Janet dropped hints on phone calls about how lonely Daniel must be. I knew who they were talking about. I knew what they expected me to do, but I held firm. Then came the Saturday Daniel showed up at my door, suitcase in hand, smirk on his face like the whole thing was settled. I told him firmly he couldn't stay long-term. His smirk dropped, his glare promised it wasn't over, and he left. After that, every family dinner was a minefield. Daniel would crack jokes about me hoarding space while he struggled. My parents would laugh, side-eyeing me as if daring me to contradict him. I started skipping dinners, but when Janet invited me to her birthday, I went out of obligation, thinking maybe it would be quiet. Instead, it was the night everything snapped. Daniel was already seated at the head of the table when I walked in, grinning, joking with relatives like he owned the room. For a while the meal went smoothly enough, but halfway through dessert, he steered the conversation back to my condo, said it was ridiculous I had a whole bedroom gathering dust while he had nowhere to live. I replied calmly, saying I had worked hard for my home and had the right to decide who stayed there. The smile on his face dropped, replaced by a look I knew too well, flat, cold, dangerous. The room went quiet. My parents' eyes were on me, waiting for me to give in like I always had, but this time I didn't. I told him plainly I wasn't responsible for fixing his life and I wouldn't be bullied into it. That was when I saw his jaw clench, his hands tightening around the edge of the table. He pushed back from his chair and stood up slowly. My parents stayed seated, silent in their practiced roles. I thought he might storm out. Instead, he reached for the bat he had brought in earlier, the one he used to show off practice swings outside. It had been leaning in the corner all night, unnoticed. He gripped it with both hands, his eyes locked on me. The scrape of it against the floor as he lifted it still rings in my ears. I barely had time to register what was happening before he swung. The first impact was a blunt explosion against my left side, a crack that tore through me like lightning. My knees buckled, the air left my body, and I hit the floor, arms clutching my ribs instinctively. The bat clattered to the ground beside me as Daniel's voice came low and cold. "That's what you get for talking back." I looked toward my parents, blood pooling under my tongue, vision blurring. Frank's arms were crossed, his jaw set not at him but at me. Janet's eyes darted back and forth, calculating whether to acknowledge the scene at all. "Call an ambulance," I gasped. Frank shook his head. "You'll be fine, stop being dramatic." The absurdity nearly drowned the pain, but another wave of it rolled over me white-hot, leaving me barely conscious. Janet finally stood, muttering about urgent care. Frank hauled me up with a grip that felt like dragging dead weight, not helping family. Daniel sat back down, scrolling his phone, smirk back in place. The ride was silent, every bump stabbing through me. At urgent care, the nurse's face hardened when she saw the bruising already blooming across my ribs. X-rays were taken and the doctor's voice was steady, almost too calm when he came back. "2 fractures. You're lucky the lung wasn't punctured. Several weeks of recovery." He asked what happened. I told the truth. He looked at my parents for confirmation. They said nothing. The nurse asked if I wanted to file a report. I hesitated, every old warning pressing on me. Before I could answer, Frank cut in. "No report necessary. It was an accident." His voice made it sound final, but this time I felt the lie burning in my chest harder than the broken bones. They wrapped my ribs, handed me prescriptions, gave me a follow-up schedule. On the drive back, Frank dropped me off at the curb like a stranger. "Take care of yourself," he muttered. Daniel never looked up from his phone as I limped past him to grab my bag. Back at my apartment, I collapsed into bed, pain buzzing through me like electricity. Every breath a reminder, every bruise spreading like ink across a page. But beneath the pain, something sharper had lodged itself: resolve. I had taken their dismissal my entire life, every shove, every insult, every bruise covered up, but the bat had changed something. This wasn't a shove in passing. It was deliberate, calculated harm. My ribs were the proof, and for the first time in my life, I knew I wasn't going to let it disappear into silence. The next morning, the bruises had darkened into grotesque shades of purple and black. Each movement was a stab of pain, each inhale a battle. I stared at the ceiling, thinking of all the mornings I had woken up hurting because of Daniel, because of my parents' silence. How many times had I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene? Too many. This time was different. I grabbed my phone and called Laura, my best friend since high school. She was at my apartment within the hour, arms full of groceries, eyes full of fury. When she saw the bruising, she clenched her jaw. "This isn't just a fight, it's assault," she said quietly. I nodded, but inside, doubt still gnawed. Years of conditioning had me wondering if I was exaggerating. She seemed to read my mind. "You are not overreacting. You're hurt. This is serious." She asked if I had the records. I showed her the folder with the X-rays and discharge papers. "Keep everything," she said. Take pictures every day. Document it. Her words felt like lifelines in the haze. That night I sat hunched on my couch, scrolling through state laws on my phone. Words like serious bodily harm, felony assault, domestic violence statutes stared back at me. 2 broken ribs qualified. The more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just family drama, it was a crime, but calling my parents was pointless. I could already hear Frank's voice telling me I provoked it. Janet's sigh about keeping things private. They wouldn't see me. They never had, so I called a lawyer instead. Laura found one through a friend, a man named Peter who specialized in cases like this. He agreed to meet the following week. In the meantime, Laura checked in daily. A neighbor helped carry groceries upstairs. Their care felt foreign, almost shocking in its contrast to my family's silence. Not one call from Frank, not one text from Janet, nothing from Daniel. They were waiting for me to drop it, to slide it into the pile of unspoken things, but I wasn't going to, not this time. Meeting Peter was nothing like I expected. I thought I'd feel small, like I was asking for too much. Instead, he leaned forward, listened carefully, and told me plainly, "What happened to you wasn't just wrong, it was criminal." I told him everything, from the condo tension to the moment the bat cracked into my ribs. He flipped through the photos and medical reports, his eyes narrowing at the fracture lines. "This is aggravated assault," he said firmly. And because it happened in a domestic setting, the law treats it even more seriously. A strange mix of validation and fear swept over me. He asked if I was ready for the fallout. Families didn't handle things like this quietly, he warned, but I told him I had already lived through the worst. Silence had been my prison. Speaking was the only way out. When I left his office, the air outside felt lighter, sharper, like I'd taken the first real breath in years. The next day, Laura drove me to the police station. I sat down across from an officer, my folder of evidence between us. He read Peter's summary, then asked me to tell the story in my own words. I told him everything, my voice shaking at first, then steadying with each sentence. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't sigh. He just wrote it all down, asked if I wanted to press charges. "Yes," I said, louder than I expected. That single word felt like reclaiming something they had stolen from me. Within a week, Daniel was served with a summons. Through a cousin, I heard he exploded when he got it, shouting that I was destroying the family. Janet left me a voicemail, her voice heavy with shame, accusing me of airing dirty laundry. Frank sent a short text, "Think about the long-term consequences." But I had already thought about them. I would rather stand alone in truth than keep choking on silence. Peter filed for a protective order, started preparing me for testimony. "She'll try to say it was an accident," he warned. "They'll try to make you sound unstable." That night, I stood in the mirror and repeated the words until they stopped shaking. "He broke my ribs with a bat, and I have the x-rays to prove it." The weeks leading up to the court date blurred into a strange rhythm of fear and focus. My ribs still throbbed whenever I moved too quickly or tried to sleep on my side, but the bigger weight was what lay ahead. Peter drilled me on possible cross-examination questions, warning me that Daniel's lawyer would try to twist everything. "They'll make it sound like you're exaggerating or like you fell and blamed him," he said. Every time my voice shook, he'd stop me, reminding me, "The truth is your anchor. You lived this, no lawyer can erase it." His words sank in deeper than he probably knew. For years, my parents had acted like my pain was imaginary, but now someone was telling me it mattered, and that it had teeth in a courtroom. Laura was a lifeline during those weeks. She dropped off groceries, reminded me to eat, even forced me to take walks around the block when I wanted to hole up inside. "You need strength for this," she'd say, handing me a jacket when the evening air chilled my ribs. Her steady presence was a sharp contrast to the silence from my family. Not a single call, not a single text asking how I was healing. If anything, I felt their disapproval buzzing in the background through relatives' whispers. Word was spreading that I was making a scene, that I was trying to ruin Daniel's future. The same old narrative, twisted just enough to protect him. I refused to let it settle on me this time. At night, I'd take the x-rays out of the folder, hold them up to the lamp. The black film lit up with the white fracture lines, harsh and undeniable, proof in bone. In a strange way, those films felt like armor. I practiced saying it in the mirror. "He broke my ribs with a bat, and I have the x-rays to prove it." Each time the words came out steadier. I wasn't just preparing for court. I was building a version of myself my family couldn't erase. The night before the hearing, sleep was impossible. My ribs ached in the cold air, my chest tight with adrenaline. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee gone cold, rehearsing answers in my head. Laura picked me up in the morning, squeezing my shoulder before we even left the driveway. "Let's go get your justice," she said simply. The words echoed as we drove toward the courthouse, the building looming gray and heavy against the winter sky. Inside, the courthouse smelled faintly of paper and coffee. My shoes clicked against the polished floor as we checked in and found our seats. Daniel walked in 20 minutes later, smug smile plastered across his face, parents flanking him like loyal guards. Janet avoided my eyes completely. Frank gave me a look that landed somewhere between disappointment and warning, the same look he used to give when I was a kid and dared to speak out. For a second, my stomach knotted, the old fear trying to pull me back under. But Peter leaned over and whispered, "They're not in control here. You are." I held on to that like a lifeline. The bailiff called our case. We walked to the front, the judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, asking if we were ready to proceed. Peter started with the evidence, his voice calm and deliberate. He put the x-rays up first, the images glowing on the screen for the whole room to see. The silence that fell was thick. Even Daniel's smirk faltered. Peter explained the fractures in plain language, cited the urgent care doctor's report, laid out exactly how much force it took to break ribs in that way. He didn't just talk about pain, he talked about intent, about harm, about what happens when a bat meets bone. When it was my turn, I walked up slowly, my ribs aching with every step. I swore to tell the truth, then told it, every word steady, every detail clear. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I just laid it out, the fight over the condo, Daniel's rage, the bat in his hands, the crack that still rang in my ears. I focused on the judge, not on him, not on my parents. I wouldn't give them that power. Still, I could feel Daniel's glare like a knife, sharp and hot at the side of my face. Then came the cross-examination. Just like Peter predicted, Daniel's lawyer tried to spin it, suggested maybe I had fallen, maybe the injury was from something else. "You could have slipped in your apartment," he pressed. My voice didn't waver. I was standing in the dining room when Daniel swung the bat into my ribs. "I have the x-rays to prove it." He tried again, pointing out past arguments, painting me as sensitive or overdramatic. Peter objected. The judge sustained. The lawyer's face tightened. Each time I answered calmly, rooted in the truth. By the end, I felt wrung out but steady. I had survived the storm. After both sides made their closing remarks, the judge said she would review the evidence and issue a decision the following week. The gavel struck. My heart thudded hard as we walked out. Laura wrapped her arms around me, whispering, "You did it." Peter told me I had been exactly what I needed to be, clear, calm, unwavering. But I felt hollow, drained, like I had left pieces of myself on that stand. Still, there was a quiet strength underneath. This time, it wasn't just my word against his. This time, my word had proof. The week between the hearing and the verdict was the longest I had ever lived. Every day stretched like taffy, slow and endless. I tried to fill the time with chores, laundry, cooking, walking, but my mind never strayed far from that courtroom. I replayed Daniel's expression when the x-rays lit up on the screen, the flicker of unease breaking through his smirk. I thought about Frank's jaw tightening, Janet's eyes darting away. For once, they couldn't control the story. The evidence was louder than them. That thought kept me upright. 2 days before the verdict, Peter called. The judge had asked for additional clarification from the medical expert, a routine step, he said, but my stomach twisted into knots. Laura reminded me it was a good sign. "The more thorough she is, the stronger it'll stand when she rules in your favor," she said. I clung to that, though sleep stayed far away. On the morning of the decision, I dressed in the same navy blazer and blouse I wore before. Nothing flashy, nothing that could be twisted, just simple, solid. Laura drove me again, her hand resting on the console between us like a quiet anchor. The courthouse felt heavier this time, the walls closing in with years of buried truth waiting to be pulled into the light. Daniel walked in with our parents at his side, but something was different. His smirk was gone. His posture was tighter. Even Janet's eyes looked nervous. Frank stayed stiff and unreadable, but I could see the cracks in his mask. We took our seats. The judge entered, papers in hand. She summarized the case, outlined the charges, the evidence, the standard of proof. My heartbeat pounded so loud I barely heard her at first. Then her eyes locked on Daniel. "The court finds that the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that you did intentionally strike your brother with a baseball bat, causing 2 fractured ribs." The words landed like a weight lifting off my chest. The air shifted. Daniel's face drained of color. Frank muttered something under his breath. Janet blinked rapidly, her lips pressed tight. The judge continued, sentencing Daniel to community service, fines, and a restraining order barring him from contacting me for 3 years. It wasn't jail, but it was public. It was official. It was a mark he couldn't erase. The gavel struck again. Laura squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. Relief, vindication, exhaustion, all flooded at once. For once, the truth hadn't been smothered. For once, it stood taller than their denials. Outside the courthouse, reporters milled around covering other cases. One of them asked if I wanted to comment. I thought for a moment, then said, "Sometimes you have to stand up, even if it means standing alone." Then I walked away, the weight in my chest lighter than it had been in years. In the days after the verdict, silence from my family settled over me like a heavy fog. No calls, no messages, not even a half-hearted "how are you?" The only sounds were the faint buzz of neighbors talking when I passed, their voices soft but their eyes full of something different now, not pity but recognition. In a small town like ours, news traveled fast, and word of the court case had already spread. Some people avoided eye contact, unsure what to say. Others gave me small nods, gestures of quiet respect. A retired teacher from high school stopped me at the grocery store, telling me she remembered the bruises I used to hide under long sleeves. She said she wished she'd spoken up back then. I didn't know how to answer, so I just thanked her and walked on, heart pounding. It was strange, painful even, that strangers now offered me the concern my own parents never had. Laura stayed by my side through everything. She checked in daily, dragging me out for walks, making sure I ate, making me laugh when the nights got too heavy. Her presence was a reminder that family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was the people who showed up, no questions asked, and stayed even when things got ugly. She never told me to forgive them. She never told me to move on faster. She just listened. That kind of loyalty was something I had craved my whole life, and here it was, finally, from someone who didn't owe me a thing. Meanwhile, word filtered back about Daniel. He raged about the verdict, blamed me for everything, told anyone who would listen that I had exaggerated, that I was vindictive. My parents backed him up, telling relatives I had twisted things. But the X-rays were public record now. The verdict was official. Their version of the story could only go so far before it ran into the wall of fact. That knowledge gave me a quiet strength. For once, their denial didn't carry the same sting. It was just noise, lies bouncing off something stronger than their voices, evidence. Still, there were nights when the weight of it all pressed hard. I'd wake from dreams of the bat swinging toward me, ribs cracking all over again. I'd sit up gasping, pain both real and remembered, hand clutching my side. On those nights, I would remind myself of the judge's words, of the film of those fractures glowing under courthouse lights. Proof I wasn't crazy. Proof I wasn't weak. It didn't erase the nightmares, but it dulled their teeth. One evening a few weeks after the verdict, Laura and I sat on my porch, the air crisp with early spring. She asked me quietly if it had been worth it. I thought about the silence of my parents, the look on Daniel's face when the verdict was read, the weight that had lifted when the truth finally stood tall in front of everyone. Yes, I said simply. It was worth it. For the first time, I felt had in my bones, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted peace, and peace only came after truth. I started therapy soon after, something I had put off for years. Sitting in that quiet room with someone who didn't know my family but listened with full attention was like opening a valve that had been locked for decades. I poured out stories I had buried, every shove, every bruise, every moment of being dismissed. My therapist helped me see patterns I had missed, ways my parents' silence had trained me to shrink, to doubt myself. It wasn't easy work. Some sessions left me raw, exhausted, trembling. But for the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Slowly, I began to rebuild, not just my ribs, but the parts of me that had been bent under years of dismissal. Daniel's restraining order meant I didn't have to see him, but small-town gossip meant I still heard about him. He struggled to find work with the record. He stayed angry, throwing blame around like darts. I didn't celebrate his downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. He had chosen his path. For once, his choices had consequences that no one could sweep under the rug. That in itself was enough. Frank and Janet stayed quiet, except through whispers passed down by relatives. They painted me as cold, as ungrateful as someone who had turned her back on family. At first, hearing that made my chest tighten. Then slowly it loosened. Their opinion of me had always been conditional. Their approval hinged on silence, on sacrifice. Without those, they had nothing kind to say, and I was learning to live without needing it. The town, though, surprised me. A neighbor left flowers on my porch with a note. You didn't deserve any of it. A woman at the library where I worked slipped me a thank you card, saying my story had given her courage to finally leave a toxic relationship. Even online, when I shared pieces anonymously on a domestic violence awareness forum, strangers responded with words like brave and strong. For so long I had been invisible, my pain ignored even in my own home. Now somehow, speaking it out loud made me seen. That visibility wasn't always comfortable, but it was healing. One night I pulled the x-rays out again, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to remember. The cracks glowed white against the dark film, clear and undeniable. They were ugly, they were painful, but they were also proof of survival, proof that I had stood up and been heard. I slid them back into their sleeve, tucked them away. I didn't need to carry them everywhere anymore. I had carried them into court. That was enough. The months rolled on, each one a little lighter than the last. My ribs healed slowly, the sharp pain easing into a dull ache that only flared on cold mornings. I started sleeping better, the nightmares coming less often. I repainted my apartment, planted flowers in mismatched pots on my balcony. Simple things, small acts of reclaiming. Every brushstroke of paint, every new bloom was a reminder. This space was mine, safe and untouchable. There were still hard days. Days when the silence of family felt like a wound, when memories of their cold stares cut deeper than Daniel's bat ever had. But therapy helped me name those feelings, place them where they belonged, not as proof of my failure, but of theirs. Slowly, I began to believe that their silence wasn't my loss. It was their choice, and I had my own choices now. On the one-year anniversary of the attack, I drove back to the courthouse. Not for a hearing, not for paperwork, just to stand outside and remember. I stood at the steps, the morning sun warming my skin, and took a deep breath. No sharp ache in my ribs this time. No fear, just air, clean and steady. I let the memory settle, not as a wound, but as proof. Proof that no matter how hard they had tried to break me, I had stood up. Proof that I had walked into that courtroom with my evidence, my truth, and my voice, and left with all three intact. Walking away from the courthouse that day, I realized I didn't need to keep the x-rays as a shield anymore. I had become my own. My ribs carried scars, but my voice carried strength. And for the first time in my life, I felt free, not because they were gone, but because I had finally chosen myself over them. And I wasn't giving that up. Spring melted into summer, and with it came a rhythm I hadn't known before. A rhythm without dread, without waiting for the next phone call that would scold me, the next demand to fix Daniel's life, the next guilt trip about family loyalty. The silence that used to sting now felt like space I could breathe in. For the first time, I had evenings that were just mine. I'd sit on my balcony with a book, the flowers I planted leaning toward the sun, and realize hours had passed without me thinking about them. That kind of peace felt foreign, but slowly it became familiar. Work at the library filled my days. I had always liked being surrounded by shelves of stories, but now the space felt different, safe. A sanctuary. Some of the regulars, kids who came in after school, older women who checked out stacks of romance novels, started lingering longer, talking to me about life outside the pages. Maybe they sensed something had shifted in me. Maybe I was just finally open enough to let people in. One afternoon, my supervisor called me into her office and offered me a promotion to branch coordinator. It wasn't a huge jump, but it meant more hours, more responsibility, and a raise that let me replace the battered couch Daniel once slashed in anger years back. Watching strangers haul that couch out of my apartment was sweeter than I expected. It felt like clearing a scar from my space. Therapy remained hard but necessary. Digging through years of buried memories wasn't pleasant, but each session loosened something. My therapist often reminded me that healing wasn't about erasing pain, but about reclaiming power. The ribs healed, she said once, but the bigger injury was that your voice was stolen. You've taken it back. I held onto that line. It became something of a mantra, especially on nights when old guilt tried to creep back in, whispering that I had betrayed family by going public. No, they were the ones who betrayed me. My only betrayal would have been staying silent. Word of my story continued to ripple through the community. At first, I wanted to disappear, to avoid the whispers and side glances, but what came surprised me. People reached out, not in pity, but in solidarity. A coworker told me quietly that her brother used to hit her, and she'd never told anyone. A neighbor admitted her son was in a controlling marriage, and she didn't know how to help. Strangers sent messages after reading my anonymous blog post online, saying they saw themselves in my words. Each time, I felt the weight of responsibility and relief at once. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was a mirror for others still trapped in silence. That mattered. It made the pain less wasted. Meanwhile, my parents stayed committed to their narrative. Through cousins, I heard that Frank and Janet told anyone who would listen that I'd blown things out of proportion, that I had embarrassed the family. It used to gut me hearing those things. Now I just let it wash over me. The verdict spoke louder than any denial they could spin, and the truth, documented in black and white fractures on an X-ray, was beyond their reach. For once, they couldn't rewrite it. Daniel drifted further out of my orbit. Rumor had it he was struggling to find steady work, his temper making things worse. He had moved a few counties over, probably to escape the eyes of people who now knew what he had done. I didn't celebrate his failures, but I also didn't feel any responsibility to save him from them. He had swung the bat. He had chosen this path, and for once, the fallout was his to carry, not mine. The small victories of independence piled up quietly but powerfully. Grocery shopping without worrying about running into them, painting the hallway a new color, hosting Laura and a few coworkers for dinner without checking over my shoulder. Each change declared, "This is mine. This is safe. They don't have the keys anymore." My therapist called it reclaiming space. I called it finally living. Of course, healing wasn't a straight line. Some mornings I woke up with the ghost of pain in my ribs, a phantom echo of that night. Some evenings, the memory of my father's cold voice, "You'll be fine. Stop being dramatic," rang in my head louder than anything else. On those days, I leaned on the reminders I had built around me, the X-rays tucked safely away, the flowers on my balcony, the messages from strangers thanking me for speaking, proof that the truth had weight, proof that I wasn't alone. One afternoon, months after the verdict, I got an email from a woman in her 60s. She had read my blog post and said my story gave her the courage to leave her husband after 40 years of emotional and physical abuse. Her words hit me harder than anything else had. She said she wished she'd had my courage decades earlier, but was grateful to have it now. I sat staring at the screen, hands trembling. For the first time, I realized the ripple effect was real. What I had endured, what I had spoken, had shifted someone else's life. That kind of weight was terrifying and freeing at once. By late summer, I noticed something else. I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. For months, anger had been the fuel that kept me moving, the thought of holding Daniel accountable giving me fire. But now, what I had was better. It was peace. The ability to wake up without dread curling in my stomach, to walk into my living room and think first of sunlight on my plants, not the crack of a bat, to laugh with Laura and know it wasn't going to be interrupted by shouting or guilt. Peace was stronger than revenge. It was the life I had always wanted, stubbornly, finally mine. One evening, Laura and I walked past the courthouse on our way to dinner. I stopped for a moment, staring at the steps, remembering the feel of the manila envelope in my hands, the X-rays inside, the nerves, the fear, the judge's words cutting through the silence. I thought about the person I was then, trembling but determined, and the person I was now, standing taller, breathing easier. I realized something vital. I didn't need to keep carrying the weight of that night. I had already carried it into court and set it down in front of the world. Now it belonged to the record, not to me. I could finally step forward without it on my back. That night I wrote another piece for the Awareness blog, this one about life after the verdict, about the quiet healing, the small victories, the peace that comes after the storm. Responses poured in again. People thanked me not just for surviving, but for showing what came next. It reminded me that survival isn't just about making it through the worst moment. It's about building a life worth living after, and that's what I was finally doing. The restraining order against Daniel gave me the safety to breathe, but I knew legal papers couldn't erase everything. Some wounds lived under the skin, some memories stayed sharp, but the difference now was that I wasn't facing them alone, and I wasn't pretending they didn't exist. I had friends who believed me, a community that had seen the truth, and a voice that finally felt steady in my own mouth. That was more than I had ever hoped for. And it was enough to keep walking forward, step by step, into a life that finally belonged to me. Autumn came with a chill in the air and the faint ache in my ribs whenever I stepped outside in the cold. By then the bruises were long gone, but the memory still pulsed beneath the surface like an old scar. I learned to live with it, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how far I had come. My days had a steadiness now. Work, therapy, dinners with Laura, quiet evenings with books. It was a rhythm I had built myself, free of their interference. Sometimes I'd catch myself waiting for the phone to buzz with one of Janet's guilt-ridden messages or Frank's cold commands, but it stayed silent. And with each silent day, I realized more and more that silence wasn't a punishment, it was freedom. Still, the distance from them wasn't without weight. Holidays passed strangely. Thanksgiving came, and for the first time I wasn't at the family table pretending everything was fine. Laura invited me to her aunt's dinner, where people welcomed me without hesitation, piling food onto my plate, asking me about my life instead of Daniel's. It was almost jarring, the ease of it. No walking on eggshells, no adjusting myself to avoid someone's anger. Just laughter, warmth, and people who didn't know my history but treated me like I mattered anyway. Driving home that night, I cried, not from sadness, but from the sharp realization of how much I had missed, how much love and normalcy I had been denied while trapped in my family's orbit. Christmas was harder. I avoided social media, not wanting to see their posts about family togetherness. But Laura showed up with cocoa and a stack of cheesy holiday movies, and we made our own celebration. It wasn't what I had grown up imagining, but maybe that was the point. I didn't need their version of family. I could build my own. Therapy deepened during those months. I started unpacking not just the violence, but the years of smaller wounds that had led there, the ignored achievements, the times my needs were brushed aside, the constant message that Daniel mattered more. Naming those things hurt, but it also freed me. My therapist often asked me to reframe questions. Instead of asking, "Why didn't they protect me?" she asked, "Why did they fail their role as parents?" Shifting the blame where it belonged chipped away at the guilt I had carried like a second skin. Slowly, I started to believe what Laura had told me 100 times. None of it was my fault, not the bruises, not the silence, not even the broken ribs. The blame lay squarely on the people who had chosen to harm me and the ones who chose to look away. Meanwhile, the community's response kept surprising me. At the library, more people began opening up quietly, sharing pieces of their own struggles. It was never dramatic, just whispered words at the checkout desk or a note tucked between returned books. "Thank you for telling your story," one read. "It helped me leave." Another, "I'm still in it, but I know now I'm not crazy." Each message was a reminder that speaking wasn't just for me. It was for anyone still trapped in shadows. I had spent so long thinking my voice was small, unimportant, but it was echoing further than I ever expected. One evening in October, I got an email from a local community center. They had read my blog post and wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at a workshop about recognizing signs of abuse. My first instinct was to say no. I wasn't a public speaker. My hands shook just thinking about standing in front of people. But then I thought about the woman in her 60s who had left her husband after reading my story. I thought about the notes tucked into books. Maybe my voice still shook, but maybe it was needed anyway, so I said yes. The night of the workshop, my nerves were so bad I thought I might bolt. Laura came with me, sitting in the front row, her steady gaze anchoring me. When I finally stepped up to the podium, the room blurred at first, but then I remembered what Peter had told me before court. The truth is your anchor. I wasn't here to perform. I was here to tell the truth, so I started from the beginning, about growing up invisible, about the favoritism, the silence, the shove that turned into a swing of a bat. About the X-rays that lit up the courtroom, undeniable. My voice trembled in the beginning, but then it steadied. By the end, the room was silent, not out of discomfort, but because they were listening, really listening. When I finished, the applause felt like a wave. I stepped down shaking but lighter. People lined up afterward just to say thank you, some with tears in their eyes. It was overwhelming, but it was also healing. Each face was proof that my story had become bigger than my pain. It had become a light for others. After that night, I started saying yes more often. Yes to speaking at another workshop. Yes to sharing more of my story online. Yes to trusting that my voice had value. Each time, the nerves came back, but so did the steadiness. My ribs still ached on cold mornings, but my voice, it was stronger than it had ever been. Daniel, meanwhile, stayed distant. The restraining order kept him away, but the rumors still drifted in. He was struggling with work, with money, with reputation. Some people pitied him. Others finally saw him for what he was. I stayed out of it. I didn't need to track his downfall. I only needed to keep walking my own path. Frank and Janet, too, stayed quiet, except for a card at Christmas signed without love. I threw it away without opening it fully. I had no interest in half apologies or shallow gestures. They had chosen silence when it mattered. I had no use for their noise now. By winter, I noticed another shift inside me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I was planning for the future, something I hadn't allowed myself to do in years. I started saving not just for bills, but for things I wanted, a trip, maybe, or a small writing course I'd always dreamed of taking. I even let myself imagine a life bigger than the one they had tried to confine me to. It was a fragile dream, but it was mine. One snowy night in December, Laura and I sat by my small Christmas tree, mugs of cocoa in hand. She looked at me and said, "Do you realize how far you've come?" I shrugged, but she pressed on. "A year ago, you were in a hospital bed with broken ribs. Now you're speaking in front of people. You're living your own life. That's not just healing, that's transformation." Her words sank in slowly but deeply. She was right. I had been broken, but I wasn't broken anymore. I was rebuilt, stronger. Louder, finally, my own. And as snow fell quietly outside, I realized something else. The bat had cracked my ribs, but it hadn't cracked me. It had woken me. It had forced me to finally step out of the shadow of silence. And I wasn't stepping back in, not now, not ever. The new year rolled in quietly, with fireworks echoing in the distance while I sat on my balcony wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea warming my hands. For once, I wasn't thinking about resolutions or how to fix myself to meet someone else's standards. I wasn't thinking about what Daniel wanted or how my parents might twist my choices. I was thinking only about what I wanted. It was such a simple shift, but it felt revolutionary. After years of bending myself into shapes to keep the peace, I was finally living without their shadows pressing down on me. January brought more invitations to speak. At first, I hesitated. Each time my old doubts crept in. Who was I to stand up in front of people? I was just someone who had survived. But maybe that was exactly why my voice mattered, so I accepted. The more I spoke, the more I realized people weren't looking for perfection. They weren't even looking for polished speeches. They wanted honesty. They wanted someone to stand in front of them and say, "This happened to me. It was real." And you're not alone. Each time I said it, I felt the truth settle deeper in my bones. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't unheard. Laura came to almost every talk, always in the front row, always the first to clap. Watching her beam with pride was something I didn't know I needed until I had it. For so long, I had craved that kind of support from my parents, only to be met with silence or scorn. Having it now from someone who chose to be there healed something raw inside me. It made me realize that love built on choice, not obligation, was stronger than anything I had grown up with. Meanwhile, Daniel faded further into the background. Every so often, someone would mention seeing him at a bar or struggling with odd jobs. I let those words slide past me. His story was no longer mine to carry. Frank and Janet, too, stayed silent, their only gestures being occasional half-hearted attempts at contact that I ignored. I didn't need to reopen wounds to know they hadn't changed. Silence from them was better than manipulation, better than guilt. Better than the old cycles that had nearly broken me. Therapy sessions in those months shifted from unpacking pain to building future goals. My therapist asked me what I wanted my life to look like 5 years from now. The question caught me off guard. For so long, survival had been the only plan. I thought about it for days. Slowly, I started to sketch an answer. Stability, peace, maybe even love. Not the kind of love that demanded silence, but the kind that celebrated my voice. I didn't know exactly how to get there, but the fact that I could imagine it at all felt like progress. Work at the library flourished. With my new role, I began organizing community events, book clubs, children's reading circles, even workshops on self-expression. One afternoon, after hosting a teen writing group, I stayed behind chatting with a girl who reminded me a lot of myself at that age, quiet, careful, eager to please. She told me she liked writing stories but didn't think anyone cared to read them. I leaned in and said, "People will care, you just have to give them the chance." The way her eyes lit up made me realize how much I wanted to keep encouraging voices like hers. Maybe that was part of my path forward, making sure others never felt as invisible as I had. Spring came again, and with it, the 1-year anniversary of the verdict. I marked it quietly, visiting the courthouse steps like I had before, standing there as the sun warmed my face. This time, though, I didn't feel the same heaviness. The building no longer loomed as a symbol of fear. It stood as a marker of change, of proof that the truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. I left flowers at the base of the steps, not as a memorial, but as a declaration. I survived. I spoke. I won't be silenced. As the months rolled on, my world kept expanding. I started joining community groups focused on awareness and prevention of domestic violence. At first, I just listened, soaking in the stories of others. But soon I found myself speaking up, sharing my own story in pieces that fit the conversation. Each time I did, someone else would nod, eyes soft with recognition. The connections built slowly, but they built strong. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged to a community that understood the language of survival and resilience. It wasn't about pity, it was about strength. One evening in June, I was invited to sit on a panel alongside other survivors. Listening to them speak, each voice raw, each story different but threaded with the same truth, I felt both humbled and proud. When it was my turn, I spoke about the night with the bat, about the silence in the car ride to urgent care, about carrying the x-rays into court. I spoke about the loneliness of standing against family and the strength I found in knowing I wasn't alone after all. When I finished, someone in the audience asked what I had learned most from the whole experience. I paused, then said, "That silence is not loyalty, it's surrender, and I will never surrender again." The applause that followed was loud, but what mattered more were the quiet nods, the people who understood exactly what I meant. Daniel's name rarely came up anymore. His anger had burned bright at first, but with time it faded into the background noise of small-town gossip. I heard he had moved again, drifting further away. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the boy he had been, the one my parents spoiled, the one who learned early that his fists got him what he wanted. I wondered if he would ever see the truth of what he had become, but I didn't dwell on it. His reckoning wasn't mine to wait for. My life was here, in the quiet mornings, in the blooming flowers on my balcony, in the laughter I now had space to welcome. Frank and Janet remained where they had always been, trapped in their need for appearances, loyal only to the story that kept them safe from shame. They never apologized, they never admitted fault, and maybe they never would. But the difference now was that I no longer needed them to. Their silence no longer defined me. My life no longer revolved around their approval. The freedom in that realization was bigger than I ever imagined. By late summer, I was writing again, not just blog posts, but longer pieces. Pages poured out of me late at night, not polished, not perfect, honest stories of survival, reflections on silence, fragments of memory stitched into something larger. Laura encouraged me to consider publishing, even if just as a collection online. "Your words already help people," she said. "Imagine what they could do if more people saw them." The thought scared me, but it also sparked something. Maybe this was another piece of my future, not just surviving, not just speaking, but writing. Creating something lasting out of the pain that once tried to erase me. Looking back at that year, I saw every step as a straight, unbroken line, even if it hadn't felt that way at the time. From the moment the bat cracked my ribs to the moment the judge read the verdict, to the quiet nights now filled with laughter and plans, each moment had carried me here. And as I stood in my apartment one evening, sunlight flooding through the windows, I realized I had rebuilt my life brick by brick, not with their help, not with their approval, but with my own two hands. And that was stronger than anything they could ever take from me. By the time autumn returned again, I hardly recognized the life I was living compared to the one I had before. The sharp edges of fear had dulled. The constant background noise of dread was gone. My ribs had healed, though one carried a small, uneven ridge that my doctor said would always be there. Sometimes, when I ran my fingers over it, I thought of it less as damage and more as a scar carved into me as proof. Proof that I survived. Proof that I stood up. My days filled with things I had once only dreamed of. I ran reading programs at the library, organized workshops, even started mentoring a few young people who reminded me of myself, quiet, overlooked, but full of potential. Seeing them bloom in a space where their voices mattered was like watching the version of myself I wished I'd had years ago. Each smile, each spark of confidence felt like a small victory. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something lasting. Writing had become another lifeline. Late at night, I sat at my desk with tea, pouring words onto the page. Sometimes it was essays about survival and healing. Other times it was fiction, thinly veiled versions of truth that let me explore without limits. Laura often read them, always encouraging me to share. Eventually, I gathered enough courage to submit a piece to a larger online publication. Weeks later, they accepted it. Seeing my words published under my name felt like reclaiming something that had always been mine, the right to be heard. Messages poured in from strangers across the country, telling me my words had resonated. It was overwhelming, but also grounding. My pain had been turned into something useful, something that might guide someone else toward their own freedom. Daniel faded further into the distance. Rumor had it he moved 2 counties over, drifting from job to job, his temper following him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Frank and Janet remained in the same house, clinging to the same stories. Sometimes I wondered if they still told people it had all been exaggerated, but the truth was it didn't matter. Their words no longer defined me. The record, the verdict, the proof, it was all bigger than their denials. I didn't need their recognition anymore. What I had was more valuable: peace, independence, and a voice they could no longer silence. Still, there were moments when the past crept in. Nights when I woke from dreams of the bat swinging toward me, the crack echoing through my ribs. Mornings when my father's cold voice, "You'll be fine, stop being dramatic," rang in my head. On those days, I reminded myself of everything that came after: the courthouse, the verdict, the workshops, the messages from people I'd helped without ever meeting. The scar was real, but it was not the whole story. It was just the beginning of a new one. One spring evening, about a year and a half after the verdict, Laura and I sat on my porch watching the sun dip low. She asked me quietly if I would ever forgive them. The question hung heavy in the air. For a long time, forgiveness had felt like the end goal, the only way to heal. But now I realized it was. "I don't think I need to," I said. "Forgiveness means I'm still giving them space in my life, and I don't want them there anymore." She nodded, squeezing my hand. For the first time, I felt no guilt in saying it. I didn't need to forgive people who had chosen silence over my safety. I only needed to keep moving forward without them. Seasons shifted again, and with them came new milestones. I applied for a grant to start a writing program at the library specifically for survivors of domestic violence. When it was approved, I cried at my desk. The program became a safe haven, a place where people could share their truths without fear of judgment. Sitting in that circle, hearing others speak their stories for the first time, I realized the ripple effect of one voice, one TR. Spoken aloud had the power to free many others. That was the legacy I wanted, not revenge, not even reconciliation, but a chain of voices growing louder until silence was no longer an option. On the 2-year anniversary of the night with the bat, I returned to the courthouse one last time. I didn't go inside. I just stood at the steps, the spring air cool against my skin, the town buzzing around me. I thought of the manila envelope in my hands that first day, the way my knees had trembled, the fear of speaking against my own family. And I thought of who I was now: steady, strong, unafraid. The courthouse was no longer a place of fear. It was a place where I had chosen myself. I left a single white flower on the steps, not out of mourning, but as a marker of closure. Then I walked away without looking back. Life kept moving, and so did I. I no longer measured my worth against their silence. I no longer bent myself to fit their expectations. My ribs had healed, my voice had grown, and my story had found its place in the world. Sometimes people still asked if I regretted it, going public, pressing charges, cutting ties. My answer was always the same: no, because silence was killing me long before the bat ever did. Speaking saved me. And every time I said it, I felt the truth of it settle deeper, stronger. To anyone listening, I'll say this: sometimes the hardest thing you can do is stand up, even when it means standing alone. But your voice matters, your truth matters, and no matter how much they try to silence you, proof is stronger than denial, and courage is stronger than fear. I carried my x-rays into court as evidence of what had been done to me, but the real evidence is the life I'm living now, free, whole, and finally mine. So if my story stayed with you, if it lit even the smallest spark of recognition or courage, I ask only this: carry it forward. Speak your truth. Stand up even if it shakes. And if you found strength here, don't forget to share this story, subscribe for more, and keep walking with me as we build a community where silence no longer wins.